The Forgotten War That Made America Powerful. This is American Global Force. Subscribe and share, because the story you are about to hear is not just about war. It is about the moment the United States stopped thinking like a young nation and started acting like a global power. A moment hidden beneath larger wars and modern headlines, yet powerful enough to change the future of the world forever. And the strange thing is that many people barely talk about it today, even though its consequences are still shaping global politics, military strategy, and American influence more than a century later. And that should make you ask yourself one question immediately. How can a war so important become so forgotten? Because when people think about the wars that made America powerful, they often jump to World War II or the Cold War. But before all of that, there was another conflict, smaller in time but enormous in impact. A war that quietly transformed America from a nation focused mostly on its own continent into a country ready to project military power across oceans. And that war was the Spanish-American War. Before this conflict began, America was still trying to define its role in the world, growing rapidly in industry and population, but uncertain about how far its influence should reach. And while many citizens believed the country should focus inward, others believed America was destined for something larger, something global. And this created a growing tension inside the nation itself, because with growing power comes a dangerous question. Should a nation use its strength only to protect itself, or should it shape the world beyond its borders? And by the late 1800s, this question was becoming impossible to ignore, especially as European empires expanded their reach across Asia, Africa, and the Pacific, controlling territories, trade routes, and military positions, while America watched from the sidelines, wondering if it too should enter the global race for influence. At the center of this growing tension was the island of Cuba, still under Spanish control, but filled with rebellion, unrest, and cries for independence. And reports of suffering inside Cuba began spreading through American newspapers. Stories filled with destruction, violence, and fear, many exaggerated for attention, but powerful enough to ignite emotions across the country. And this is where the media began playing a major role, because newspaper publishers realized that fear and outrage sold papers. So dramatic headlines flooded the public, pushing Americans toward anger against Spain. And this raises another important question. How much power does information have in shaping a nation's path toward war? Because long before social media or television, newspapers were already influencing public emotion and political pressure, creating a wave of nationalism that leaders could no longer ignore. Then came the event that shocked the nation, the explosion of the USS Maine in Havana Harbor in February 1898. Killing hundreds of American sailors and instantly turning tension into fury. And even though the exact cause of the explosion was never fully proven, newspapers immediately blamed Spain with explosive headlines screaming for revenge, and suddenly the country was united around one powerful emotion, anger. And you can imagine the atmosphere at the time. Crowds demanding action, politicians facing pressure, military leaders preparing for conflict, and a growing belief that America needed to prove itself on the world stage. And this is where everything began to change. Because once a nation begins to see war, not just as defense, but as opportunity, its future starts moving in a completely different direction. When war officially began in April 1898, many expected a difficult and prolonged conflict. But what followed shocked the world, because the American military moved quickly and aggressively, targeting Spanish forces not only in Cuba but across the globe. And suddenly the war expanded far beyond the Caribbean into the Pacific Ocean, revealing something astonishing. America was no longer thinking locally. It was thinking internationally, and nowhere was this clearer than in the Philippines, where American naval forces under George Dewey destroyed the Spanish fleet in the Battle of Manila Bay with stunning speed. A victory that shocked European powers and announced that the United States was now capable of projecting military strength thousands of miles from home. And think about how significant this moment really was. Because before this war, many nations viewed America as powerful economically, but inexperienced globally. Yet within months, that perception began to change dramatically. Meanwhile, in Cuba, American forces advanced against Spanish defenses, including the famous charge up San Juan Hill involving future President Theodore Roosevelt and his Rough Riders, a moment that would become legendary in American history. And while the image of Roosevelt charging into battle became iconic, the reality of the war was much harsher. filled with disease, poor logistics, and brutal conditions, reminding everyone that military glory often hides painful realities behind it. And this raises another question. How often do nations remember the victories of war while forgetting the suffering that made those victories possible? Because the Spanish-American War was not only a military turning point, it was also a lesson in the cost of expansion and the complexity of global power. But perhaps the most important part of the story is what happened after the fighting ended, because victory brought America something it had never truly possessed before: overseas territories, including Puerto Rico, Guam, and the Philippines, and suddenly the United States found itself controlling lands far beyond North America. And this sparked intense debate across the country, because many Americans celebrated the rise of their nation, while others feared that imperial expansion betrayed the country's original values. And this is where the real transformation happened, because America now faced a completely new identity, no longer simply a republic focused on survival, but an emerging power with global interests, global responsibilities, and global ambitions. And the world noticed immediately because after the war, foreign nations began looking at America differently, not just as an economic force, but as a military power capable of influencing international affairs. And this shift would pave the way for future interventions, naval expansion, and a stronger global presence in the decades ahead, eventually shaping America's role in both world wars and beyond. And that is why this forgotten conflict matters so much, because without it, the modern global influence of the United States might never have developed in the same way. So as you think about this first chapter, ask yourself something important. Was the Spanish-American War truly about freeing Cuba, or was it the moment America discovered its own hunger for global influence? Because once a nation realizes its power, history shows that it rarely turns back. And in the next chapter, we will uncover how the war spread across oceans, shocked the world, and revealed a new kind of American ambition that many never saw coming. This is American Global Force. Subscribe and share, because the deeper we go into this forgotten war, the more unbelievable the story becomes. Because what began as a conflict centered around Cuba quickly transformed into something much larger, something few Americans had expected at the time: a war stretching across oceans, pulling the United States into distant territories thousands of miles away, and revealing for the first time that America was no longer thinking like a nation trapped between two coastlines, but like a country preparing to operate on a global scale. And this is where the real transformation began, because military victories are one thing, but realizing you can project power across the world changes a nation forever. At the beginning of the war, many Americans believed the conflict would remain focused on the Caribbean, especially around Cuba, where rebellion against Spanish rule had already weakened Spain's control. But military planners in Washington understood something critical. If the United States truly wanted to defeat Spain quickly, it could not fight only in one location. It had to attack Spain's wider empire. And suddenly attention shifted far beyond the Atlantic Ocean to the Pacific, toward a distant chain of islands that most Americans barely knew existed at the time, the Philippines. And that raises an important question. How does a country suddenly go from fighting near its own shores to waging war on the other side of the planet? Because this was not simply a military decision, it was a psychological turning point, proof that American leaders were beginning to think globally. The man who would carry out this mission was George Dewey, commander of the American Asiatic Squadron. And before the war even officially began, Dewey had already received instructions to prepare for action against the Spanish fleet in Manila Bay, showing that American leaders were planning far beyond Cuba from the very start. And imagine the tension at that moment, thousands of miles from home, in unfamiliar waters, preparing for a battle that could change the balance of power in the Pacific. Because if Dewey failed, the United States would appear weak and overextended. But if he succeeded, the entire world would see American military power in a completely new way. Then came May 1st, 1898, one of the most important days in the history of the United States Navy, as Dewey's fleet entered Manila Bay under darkness and prepared to engage the Spanish fleet. And what happened next shocked observers everywhere, because the battle was devastatingly one-sided. American ships destroyed the Spanish fleet with overwhelming efficiency while suffering minimal losses themselves, and Dewey's famous words, "You may fire when ready," became legendary, symbolizing not just confidence, but the arrival of a new military force on the global stage. And this should make you stop and think, how could a country, once considered isolated and inexperienced, suddenly defeat a European empire so decisively halfway across the world? The answer lies partly in technology and preparation, because by the late 19th century, the United States had rapidly industrialized, building stronger ships, modern weapons, and a growing navy capable of competing internationally, and this war became the first true test of that new strength. And what the world saw in Manila Bay was not luck. It was evidence that America's industrial growth had finally translated into military capability, and that realization sent shockwaves through foreign governments, especially European powers that had long dominated global affairs because now a new competitor had entered the arena. But victory in the Philippines created a dangerous new problem, because once American forces defeated Spain there, a major question emerged. What would happen to the islands next? And this issue became deeply controversial because Filipino revolutionaries under Emilio Aguinaldo had also been fighting against Spanish rule and believed independence was finally within reach. Yet instead of immediately granting freedom, the United States began moving toward control of the islands itself. And suddenly America faced accusations that it was becoming the very type of imperial power it once criticized. And this raises a powerful question. Can a nation fight in the name of liberation while also expanding its own influence? Back in the Caribbean, the fighting intensified as American troops landed in Cuba. But despite patriotic speeches and dramatic newspaper headlines, the reality on the ground was far from glorious, because soldiers faced extreme heat, disease, poor supplies, and confusion, with illnesses killing far more troops than combat itself. And this is something history often hides behind heroic stories, the brutal human cost of war. Because while newspapers celebrated victories, ordinary soldiers suffered through conditions many were unprepared for. And that contrast between public excitement and battlefield reality is something that appears repeatedly throughout history. One of the most famous moments came during the Battle of San Juan Hill, where American forces, including Theodore Roosevelt's Rough Riders, launched a charge that became one of the defining images of the war, and Roosevelt himself emerged from the conflict as a national hero, using his wartime fame to launch a political career that would eventually carry him to the presidency. And this is another fascinating part of the story because wars do not only reshape nations, they create powerful figures whose influence can last for decades. And Roosevelt would later become one of the strongest advocates for expanding American naval and military power worldwide. As victories continued, it became increasingly clear that Spain could not win the war, its empire weakened, its military overstretched, and its resources limited compared to America's growing industrial and naval strength. And by the summer of 1898, the outcome was already becoming obvious. But what many people failed to understand at the time was that the real consequences of the war would begin after the fighting stopped, because defeating Spain was only the beginning. The far bigger question was what kind of nation America would become afterward. When peace negotiations finally began, the United States demanded control over several Spanish territories, including Puerto Rico, Guam, and the Philippines. And suddenly America possessed overseas territories stretching across both the Caribbean and the Pacific. And this transformed the nation strategically, because now the United States had military positions, naval bases, and political interests far beyond its own continent. And that should make you think carefully about how quickly nations can change once they begin expanding their influence, because only months earlier America had entered the war claiming humanitarian concerns, yet now it stood on the edge of becoming a global empire itself. Not everyone supported this transformation, however, because critics argued that controlling foreign territories contradicted the principles of liberty and self-determination that America claimed to represent. And this debate became fierce, dividing politicians, intellectuals, and ordinary citizens, with some believing expansion would bring prosperity and power, while others feared it would corrupt the nation's identity. And this debate still echoes today whenever questions arise about military intervention and global influence. But regardless of the arguments, one fact could no longer be denied. The Spanish-American War had permanently changed America's relationship with the world, because after 1898, the United States no longer acted like a distant observer of global affairs. It became an active participant, increasingly willing to project military power abroad, defend overseas interests, and shape international events. And that transformation would only grow stronger in the years ahead. And as this new century approached, another question began to emerge. If America had risen this quickly after one short war, how far would it eventually go once it fully embraced its role as a global power? Because the next chapter will reveal how victory brought unexpected consequences, hidden resistance, and a brutal struggle that many Americans never saw coming. This is American Global Force. Subscribe and share, because the deeper this story goes, the more complicated America's rise to power becomes, because victory in the Spanish-American War did not bring immediate peace or universal celebration. Instead, it opened the door to a dangerous new reality that many Americans were completely unprepared for, a reality filled with resistance, political division, and a growing question that would haunt the nation for years. Had America become the very kind of empire it once opposed? Because once the cheering faded and the headlines moved on, the true cost of expansion began to reveal itself. When the war officially ended in late 1898, the United States emerged victorious and suddenly found itself in possession of overseas territories stretching across the Caribbean and Pacific, including Puerto Rico, Guam, and most controversially, the Philippines. And at first, many Americans celebrated these gains as proof that their country had entered a new era of greatness. Newspapers praised military success. Politicians spoke proudly about national destiny. And business leaders imagined new markets and trade opportunities across Asia. But beneath all this excitement, something dangerous was growing. Because while Americans viewed the Philippines as a strategic victory, many Filipinos viewed the situation very differently. For years, Filipino revolutionaries had fought against Spain, believing independence was their ultimate goal. And leaders like Emilio Aguinaldo expected the United States to support their freedom after defeating Spain. But instead, American leaders began preparing to establish control over the islands themselves, arguing that the Philippines needed stability, guidance, and protection. And this immediately created tension, because from the Filipino perspective, one colonial ruler seemed to be replacing another. And that raises an uncomfortable question. Can a country claim to spread freedom while denying independence to people who are demanding it for themselves? At first, American officials believed resistance would be limited, but they were disastrously wrong, because anger quickly exploded into armed conflict, beginning what became known as the Philippine-American War, a brutal and often overlooked struggle that revealed the darker side of America's new global ambitions. And unlike the short war against Spain, this conflict dragged on, becoming violent, exhausting, and deeply controversial, with Filipino fighters using guerrilla tactics against American troops unfamiliar with the terrain and climate. And suddenly the United States found itself trapped in a difficult occupation, far from home, fighting an enemy determined to resist foreign control. Think about how shocking this must have felt to ordinary Americans at the time, because only months earlier newspapers had celebrated liberation and victory. Yet now American soldiers were engaged in a harsh counterinsurgency campaign against people who also claimed to be fighting for freedom. And reports of brutal conditions, burned villages, and civilian suffering began reaching the public, creating growing discomfort back home. And this is where the image of America as a purely liberating force began to crack, because power often changes how nations behave, especially when strategic interests become involved. Meanwhile, inside the United States, fierce political arguments erupted over imperialism itself, with supporters claiming expansion would strengthen the economy, spread American influence, and secure military advantages, while critics warned that empire contradicted the nation's founding ideals. And some of the strongest opposition came from the Anti-Imperialist League, a movement that included influential writers, politicians, and intellectuals who believed overseas expansion threatened American democracy. And this debate became one of the most important political struggles of the era, because it forced Americans to confront a difficult truth. What kind of country were they becoming? One of the most famous critics was Mark Twain, who sharply attacked imperialism and questioned whether America was abandoning its moral principles in pursuit of power. And his criticism reflected a growing fear that military victories abroad could slowly transform the nation itself, because once a country begins controlling foreign territories through force, it risks changing not only its role in the world, but also its identity at home. And that should make you think about how often nations justify expansion by claiming noble intentions while pursuing strategic advantage underneath. Despite the controversy, however, America continued strengthening its overseas presence, building naval bases, increasing military deployments, and developing new strategies for projecting power across oceans, and this period marked the beginning of a major transformation in American military thinking, because leaders realized that controlling distant territories required a stronger navy, faster communication, and permanent global reach. And suddenly military planners were no longer focused only on defending the homeland. They were preparing for international influence on a scale America had never attempted before. One man who strongly believed in this vision was Alfred Thayer Mahan, whose writings argued that sea power was the key to national greatness, and his ideas became enormously influential after the Spanish-American War, helping shape America's decision to expand its navy and establish overseas bases. And this is fascinating because it shows how wars do more than create immediate victories. They reshape long-term strategy, pushing nations toward entirely new futures. And after 1898, America increasingly embraced the belief that controlling the seas meant controlling global influence. At the same time, the rest of the world was watching carefully, because European powers that once dismissed America as inexperienced now recognized that the United States had become a rising force capable of competing internationally. And this shift in perception mattered enormously, because global power depends not only on strength itself, but also on how other nations perceive that strength. And after the Spanish-American War, the image of America changed dramatically from a regional power to an emerging empire with worldwide ambitions. Yet for all the celebrations of national strength, the war left deep scars both abroad and at home. Because thousands of lives had been lost, resistance continued in the Philippines, and political divisions inside America grew sharper, and this created a strange contradiction. The nation had become more powerful than ever before, but it had also become more conflicted about what that power meant, and perhaps that is one of the greatest lessons of this forgotten war, because rising influence often comes with moral uncertainty, forcing nations to choose between ideals and ambition. And then there was another important consequence many people overlooked at the time. The war transformed the American presidency itself because figures like Theodore Roosevelt emerged from the conflict believing the United States had a destiny to lead internationally. And this mindset would shape future foreign policy for decades, encouraging stronger military expansion, greater international involvement, and a willingness to intervene abroad whenever American interests appeared threatened. And once that mindset took hold, it became almost impossible to reverse. So as this chapter closes, ask yourself something important. Did America simply win a war against Spain, or did it cross a line that permanently changed its role in the world forever? Because the next chapter will reveal how this forgotten conflict opened the door to America's rise as a naval giant, reshaping global strategy and preparing the nation for even greater power in the 20th century. This is American Global Force. Subscribe and share, because after the smoke of the Spanish-American War began to fade, the United States faced a realization that would change its future forever. Victory overseas was impossible without control of the seas, and this lesson became one of the most powerful turning points in American military history, because before 1898, the United States had a growing navy, but after the war it became obsessed with building one of the strongest naval forces the world had ever seen, and that obsession would eventually place American warships in every major ocean on Earth. The war revealed something astonishing to American leaders. Distance no longer protected nations the way it once had, because modern ships, global trade, and overseas territories meant power could no longer remain confined to a single continent, and this frightened many strategists. Because if America wanted to protect its growing influence, it needed more than soldiers. It needed fleets capable of moving quickly across oceans, defending trade routes, and responding to crises anywhere in the world. And this is where naval expansion transformed from military policy into national strategy. At the center of this transformation stood powerful voices arguing that the future belonged to nations that rule the seas, especially naval strategist Alfred Thayer Mahan, whose ideas became almost legendary among political and military leaders. Because Mahan believed history proved one thing clearly: the greatest empires were the ones with dominant navies. And after the Spanish-American War, many Americans became convinced he was right. because they had just witnessed how quickly naval victories in places like Manila Bay could change global perception and military outcomes. This belief pushed the United States into a new era of shipbuilding unlike anything it had attempted before, with modern battleships, armored cruisers, and advanced naval technology becoming national priorities. And suddenly American ports were filled with massive steel warships designed not only to defend coastlines, but to operate far from home for extended periods. And this should make you pause and think. Because once a country builds a navy capable of reaching anywhere, its ambitions often begin reaching further too. Perhaps no leader symbolized this transformation more than Theodore Roosevelt, whose experiences during the war deeply shaped his vision of America's future. Because Roosevelt believed the nation must act boldly, expand its military strength, and command international respect through power. And once he became president, he aggressively expanded the Navy, supported overseas influence, and pushed America further into global affairs than ever before. And this is important because Roosevelt did not see military power as optional. He saw it as essential to national greatness. One of the clearest symbols of this new mindset came in 1907 with the journey of the Great White Fleet, a massive group of American battleships painted white that traveled around the world to demonstrate U.S. naval strength. And imagine how astonishing this appeared at the time. Giant American warships sailing across oceans, visiting foreign ports, and showing the world that the United States could now project power globally, because this was not only military strategy, it was psychological warfare, a message to allies and rivals alike that America had officially entered the competition for global influence. But behind this growing confidence was also fear, because military leaders understood that rising powers often attract new enemies and greater responsibilities, and as America's overseas interests expanded, so did concerns about protecting trade routes, defending territories, and maintaining influence in both the Atlantic and Pacific Oceans. And suddenly the nation faced strategic questions it had rarely considered before. What happens if conflict erupts simultaneously in different parts of the world? How can distant territories be defended quickly? And how much military power is enough to secure global interests? These concerns pushed the United States toward another revolutionary project, the construction of the Panama Canal, because after the Spanish-American War, military planners realized something dangerous. Moving ships between the Atlantic and Pacific took far too long, forcing vessels to travel around South America. And in a crisis, this delay could prove disastrous. So the canal became more than an engineering dream. It became a strategic necessity, allowing the Navy to shift forces rapidly between oceans and strengthening America's ability to operate globally. At the same time, foreign nations began reacting to America's growing strength with a mixture of respect, caution, and concern, because European empires that once dominated international affairs now saw the United States emerging as a serious competitor, especially in the Pacific, where American influence expanded rapidly after acquiring territories from Spain, and this growing presence brought America closer to Asia politically, economically, and militarily, laying the groundwork for future conflicts and rivalries that would shape the 20th century. Yet even as naval power increased, many Americans still debated whether the country was losing part of its original identity, because some feared the pursuit of empire and military dominance would eventually drag the nation into endless foreign conflicts. And history shows those fears were not entirely wrong, because after the Spanish-American War, America became increasingly involved in international crises, interventions, and wars abroad, each one reinforcing its role as a global power while also creating new challenges and controversies. Still, one reality could no longer be denied. The forgotten War of 1898 had permanently changed America's direction, because before it, the United States was largely focused inward. But after it, the nation began looking outward across oceans, building fleets, expanding influence, and preparing to shape world events on a scale unimaginable only decades earlier. And as this chapter ends, ask yourself something critical. Was America building a navy for defense alone, or was it preparing for a future where global power would depend on controlling the seas? Because in the next chapter, we will uncover how this forgotten conflict reshaped America's economy, politics, and global ambitions in ways that still affect the modern world today. This is American Global Force. Subscribe and share, because by the early 20th century, the effects of the Spanish-American War were becoming impossible to ignore. And what once seemed like a short overseas conflict had now transformed the future of the United States in ways few people could have imagined when the war first began. Because America was no longer acting like a cautious young republic, trying to avoid foreign entanglements. It was beginning to move like an emerging superpower determined to influence world events far beyond its own borders. One of the biggest changes appeared in the American economy itself because overseas expansion opened new markets, trade opportunities, and access to strategic locations across the Caribbean and Pacific. And suddenly businesses, shipping companies, and industrial leaders saw enormous possibilities abroad, pushing the government to protect international commerce more aggressively than ever before. And this created a powerful connection between economic growth and military strength, because protecting trade required naval power, overseas bases, and political influence. And once these systems became linked together, America's global expansion accelerated rapidly. At the same time, American politics also began changing dramatically, because presidents after the war increasingly believed the nation had both the right and responsibility to shape international affairs. And this mindset would influence future interventions throughout Latin America, Asia, and beyond, creating a pattern where military and political power became tools of global influence. And that raises a critical question. Once a nation becomes powerful enough to shape world events, can it ever truly return to isolation again? Meanwhile, the psychological effect of victory remained enormous, because the war gave Americans something they had not fully possessed before: confidence on the world stage. And this confidence influenced everything from foreign policy to military planning, encouraging leaders to think bigger, act faster, and project strength internationally. And perhaps this was the most important transformation of all, because nations often become global powers not only through weapons or wealth, but through belief in their own influence. But hidden beneath this confidence were warning signs many people ignored, because overseas expansion also brought resistance, resentment, and long-term obligations, especially in territories where American control remained controversial. And this revealed a dangerous truth about empire. Gaining influence is often easier than managing its consequences. And history would show repeatedly that global power comes with constant challenges, requiring military presence, political strategy, and economic commitment for decades. Still, by the time the world moved closer toward the 20th century's larger conflicts, one fact had become undeniable. The Spanish-American War had opened the door to America's rise as a dominant global force, setting the stage for its future role in world wars, international alliances, and global military leadership. And without that forgotten conflict, the modern image of American power might never have developed the same way. So as this chapter closes, ask yourself one final question. Did America simply win a war against a fading empire? Or did it unknowingly begin a journey that would eventually place it at the center of global power for generations to come? Because the answer to that question may explain far more about the modern world than most people realize. This is American Global Force. Subscribe and share, because history is never truly forgotten. It only waits for the right moment to reveal its importance again. This is American Global Force. Subscribe and share, because after the Spanish-American War, the world no longer viewed the United States as a distant republic protected by oceans. Instead, nations across Europe, Asia, and Latin America began realizing something that would permanently reshape international politics. America had entered the race for global influence, and unlike older empires struggling with decline, the United States possessed something far more dangerous: growing industrial strength, expanding military power, and enormous economic potential, all at the same time. European leaders watched carefully as American naval fleets expanded and overseas bases multiplied, because for centuries nations like United Kingdom, France, and Germany had dominated global politics through colonial empires and naval superiority. But now a younger and rapidly rising power was beginning to challenge that balance. And this created both anxiety and competition, because history shows that whenever a new power rises quickly, the world becomes unstable, especially when older powers fear losing influence. What made America especially unique was that its rise happened with astonishing speed, because within only a few decades it transformed from a nation recovering after Civil War into one capable of projecting force across oceans, controlling strategic territories, and influencing international trade routes. And this rapid growth shocked foreign governments, that once underestimated American ambition, and suddenly military planners around the world had to consider a new reality. American intervention could affect conflicts almost anywhere. At home, many Americans celebrated this growing reputation, believing the country had finally achieved the respect and strength it deserved. But others worried about the consequences of becoming deeply involved in world affairs because greater influence also meant greater responsibility, larger military spending, and increased risk of foreign conflict. And this debate intensified as America became more active internationally, especially in regions where political instability threatened its economic or strategic interests. The psychological impact of the war remained powerful as well, because the victory over Spain convinced many leaders that American power could reshape international events quickly and decisively, and this confidence encouraged future interventions abroad, reinforcing the idea that the United States had both the capability and responsibility to act globally whenever necessary. And over time, this mindset became deeply connected to American foreign policy itself. But perhaps the most important consequence of all was this. The Spanish-American War changed how future generations of Americans understood their country's role in the world, because after 1898, global influence no longer seemed impossible or distant. It became expected, and that expectation would guide the nation through world wars, Cold War rivalries, and international conflicts for more than a century afterward. And as this chapter ends, think carefully about this question. If one short, forgotten war could transform America so dramatically, what other hidden moments in history may have quietly shaped the modern world without most people ever realizing it? This is American Global Force. Subscribe and share, because as this story comes to an end, one thing should now be clear. The Spanish-American War was never just a short war between the United States and Spain. It was the turning point that changed the future of global power forever. The moment America stepped onto the world stage, not as a developing nation, but as a rising force capable of shaping history itself. And what makes this even more astonishing is how many people barely discuss it today, even though its consequences still echo through modern military strategy, foreign policy, and international politics more than a century later. Before 1898, America was largely focused inward, growing economically, rebuilding after internal struggles, and expanding across its own continent. But after the war, something fundamental changed, because for the first time, the nation experienced what it meant to project military force across oceans, control overseas territories, and influence distant regions thousands of miles away. And once that transformation happened, there was no going back, because power changes how nations see themselves, and perhaps, even more importantly, it changes how the world sees them. The war reshaped nearly every part of America's future, from military expansion to economic growth, from political ambition to naval dominance, and many of the systems that define modern American influence can trace part of their origins back to this forgotten conflict, because the rise of overseas bases, the expansion of the Navy, and the belief that America should play a leading role in world affairs all gained momentum after the victory over Spain. And that momentum would eventually carry the United States into world wars, global alliances, and international leadership throughout the 20th century. But this story is not only about success and strength, because hidden beneath the victories were painful contradictions that still raise difficult questions today. Because while America claimed to support freedom and liberation, it also expanded its own control abroad, especially in places like the Philippines, where resistance against American rule turned into a brutal conflict. And this contradiction remains one of the most debated parts of the nation's rise to power, forcing historians and citizens alike to ask whether great powers can truly expand influence without compromising some of their ideals. And perhaps that is what makes this war so important to understand, because it reveals a truth about history that many people overlook. The moments that change the world are not always the longest wars or the deadliest battles. Sometimes they are the conflicts that quietly alter a nation's direction, shifting its identity, ambitions, and relationship with the rest of the world forever. And the Spanish-American War did exactly that. Think about how different the modern world might look if America had never entered that war, if it had remained more isolated, avoided overseas expansion, and resisted becoming deeply involved in international affairs, because without that transformation, the balance of power during the 20th century could have unfolded very differently. And even major events like the World Wars, Cold War alliances, and modern American military presence overseas might not have developed the same way. What makes this even more fascinating is that the war itself lasted only a few months, yet its impact stretched across generations, proving that the importance of a conflict is not measured only by how long it lasts, but by how deeply it changes the future afterward. And in this case, the future changed dramatically, because after 1898, America no longer saw oceans as barriers protecting it from the world. It began seeing them as pathways toward influence, trade, military reach, and global strategy. Today, the United States maintains military bases across the world, operates one of the most powerful navies in history, and plays a central role in international politics. And while many events contributed to that rise, the forgotten war against Spain was one of the earliest moments that set this transformation into motion. The spark that pushed America beyond its old limits and into a new era of global ambition. And maybe the most astonishing part of all is this: the debates that began during that war never truly ended, because even today Americans still argue about military intervention, overseas influence, and the balance between national ideals and strategic interests, showing that the questions raised in 1898 continue to shape political discussions more than a century later. And that proves this war is not really forgotten at all. Its legacy is simply hidden inside the modern world itself. So as this journey ends, ask yourself one final question. Was the Spanish-American War merely a conflict from the past, or was it the moment the modern American era truly began? Because understanding that answer may help explain not only how America became powerful, but why it continues to influence global events today. This is American Global Force. Subscribe, share, and stay curious. Because history is never just about the past, it is the key to understanding the future.